So we are now going to segue beautifully into kind of one of the issues that Martin raised there, which is, I suppose, the whole kind of question of information, disinformation, and truth in the age of AI. And we've got a fantastic sort of multidisciplinary panel to talk that through with. So if I could invite my panelists up to join us. We've got the Right Honourable Chloe Smith, who is former Secretary of State of DSIT. We've got Claire Levens, who's Head of Media Literacy at Ofcom. We've got Eric Chowdhury, who's Head of Policy at the Royal Society, and Simon Staffel, who's Director of Government Affairs at Microsoft. So thank you all very much for joining me. Oh, sorry, yeah, we're make sure we've got enough chairs. So thanks very much. So, Martin, in the last session, kind of talked about the way in which, for him, and I think for lots of other organisations, 2024 was the year of big elections around the world. I mean, it was the biggest year for sort of democratic elections around the globe, I think, ever. And there was this kind of enormous focus on, we had the launch of kind of generative AI, ChatGPT, and so on. And I think, there was a real sense of sort of anxiety about the role that synthetic media might play in those kind of democratic processes that took place. But then actually, to some extent, it was the dog that didn't bark through the course of the year, because actually it didn't appear that sort of generative AI derived sort of synthetic media had a big information. That's not to say that any of these processes were a kind of a masterclass of being kind of completely accurate, if I could say that, or just just part of the human discourse rather than the AI discourse. So maybe that's an interesting place to start. I'd be interested in your kind of perspectives around kind of your concerns around the issue. What on reflection, have we dodged a bullet, or have we actually were we looking in the wrong kind of issues? We'll then broaden it out to a broader discussion about actually how is synthetic media kind of changing people's perceptions of reality. But Chloe, as a politician, very interested in your thoughts about the role of synthetic media and the political discourse and how we get that right.
Yeah, and really delighted to be with you this afternoon. The idea that politicians wouldn't always be accurate is a horror, Anthony. I don't know how you've managed to
I didn't know quite how else to say it. But, yeah.
So I think I better paint myself this afternoon as a recovering politician. I'm now an ex-politician that just has a few thoughts to share on this subject. So there's a couple of bits of experience I wanted to talk from. So one is having been Secretary of State in the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology. But actually, perhaps more accurately to this is having been a lawmaker and a constituency MP for 15 years and having been elections minister. So the first thing I wanted to delve into was the experience of whether our electoral law is robust enough and how that saw us through 2024. And then I wanted to come on to just the other democratic institutions that are in play as well. Like many, I reviewed the year ahead of us in 2024 and said, look, there's billions of citizens going to the ballot box. And because that cluster of elections were effectively the first to happen at scale since we'd also experienced AI at sort of public common scale, there was worry. There were worries, quite understandably. And we heard that actually this morning from Melissa as well on the earlier panel. And, GCHQ was saying, well, you can't be complacent. And people thought there were going to be deep fakes and AI being a multiplier for all sorts of underhand activity. And there's the obvious logical point that it might have been very difficult for enforcement agencies to move fast enough during the time-limited period of an election. But I think, for me, I was thinking that the UK's electoral legislative framework was enough, was adequate for this situation. Now, you also already have a set of other laws in operation, of which Ofcom is now the expert. So I'll defer to Claire saying a bit more on the Online Safety Act and so on later. I think there were some false arguments put that you needed more laws to deal with AI in an election contest. And the reason I particularly disagree with those arguments is because actually fundamentally it's an exercise in free speech and the freedom to decide once you've heard the freedom to speak. That is really the kind of absolute bedrock of this. So we have a law that trusts people's choices and says that we're not going to regulate policy or ideas or facts or figures because actually those are matters for debate and they're capable of being presented and rebutted and believed or not believed. And that's up to people to take that kind of choice. Now, all that said, I think the elections this year were clearly quite noisy around the globe, but people in all reaches of the globe took their decisions, and some of those decisions were pretty momentous. Touching on the kind of historical point of this then, much of that is not new, right? It doesn't take AI to make elections full of skullduggery. Occasionally elections have attracted skullduggery. Dare I put that one out there? So again, you shouldn't be complacent in the face of that, but actually we shouldn't think that this is a fundamentally new challenge. One thing that I'm watching at the moment that I think will add a layer to this is events in Romania. So people will be aware of the recount that has been ordered. I'm no expert in the precise situation, but I did note one of the candidates there saying that positions should be, quote, fought by voting, not by backstage games, and she calls on the Central Election Bureau to handle the recount very wisely, and I think that's a sensible position in a very live environment. So, look, it's a really daunting world, but only citizens can judge, and I think that's really the absolutely fundamental point there. There were some stats that came from the Electoral Commission about our election this year, and I'll just put those out because they make for great discussion material. Over half of people in the UK said they saw misleading or inaccurate information about policies and candidates. The most common response was to ignore it. 64% ignored it, did nothing. Did synthetic media form an absolute deluge this year? Only 1 in 10 candidates said they used AI for a range of tasks. More traditional methods remain an effective way for candidates to communicate with the public. Most common ways people said they saw information were leaflets and flyers at 2/3 of people. So, again, we perhaps don't need to make big arguments for new things here. I just want to touch on institutions beyond elections. I mean, I think there's a massive challenge for Parliament as an institution in the face of volume and in the face of perhaps authentication and validation of who is saying what amongst MPs' constituents. And then also in terms of keeping to your North Star. What is it that you as an MP or you as the government is trying to do, and then keeping true to that in the face of a lot of movement. Technology is massively moving around it. I mean, as other panelists have said today, campaigners and so on in the political space are just like businesses working out where the ROI actually is of AI. That is just as true in this context as it is, where other panelists have said that today, and that's what I see in my work nowadays of working with businesses on this. It's all about the ROI, and it's about the adoption, and it's about that section of movement. I'll pause there.
No, very interesting. And I mean, I studied history in my degree, and if you look back, I mean, elections are often far more about perception than necessarily kind of facts and reality, and that's sort of always sort of been the case. But Simon, I wanted to come to you because I mean, Microsoft, along with lots of other kind of very large kind of techUK members, were, I think, very focused on, at the beginning of the year that there were some real risks if AI was seen to be a real source of disinformation that had a real material impact on electoral outcomes. So, I mean, I know that for you as a company and a number of others, I think you were very focused on that issue from the outset. But interested in terms of kind of what you learned from that, and as a company.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for having me, Anthony. And I agreed with the points that Chloe was making. I thought some really fascinating points about actually what happened in the election, So I agree with that the overall, what we saw was perhaps less than we expected. I think there's an interesting counterfactual in terms of there was a huge amount of effort to try to prevent, and so hopefully some of that was impactful. But I think we were right not to be complacent. I agree with that point as well, and I think that's because partly the threat landscape that we see, and obviously people in government will see this as well. Microsoft are tracking nation-state threats from 1,500 groups at any one time, 600 million cyber attacks a day. Some of those are targeting, a lot of those are targeting democratic institutions. So there is a very clear threat there, and so I think we're right to be keeping the eye on that. And there were some activities, and in terms of disinformation campaigns. If we think most recently in the US election, we did see groups linked to nation-state actors, Iranian groups tending to target the Trump campaign, and Russian-linked groups tending to target the Harris campaign. And then there were sort of groups linked to Chinese nation-state groups, we think, who were sort of looking more systemically at using AI to just generally cause discord. So there was activity, and we've put out some reports about that. So I think it's right that we thought about that, but overall I would agree that perhaps it was a bit less than we thought, and that's a good thing. I think the other reason why it was really important to focus on it is because of what's at stake. Fundamentally this is about, and this is the subject of this panel, is about protecting democracy, and I think there is really high stakes here. And also it's about trust in technology, and this point that came up earlier on in the day, that we're entering this age of AI where we need people to have trust in this technology so they can take advantage of using this new general purpose technology. So we did a lot of work focused on elections, and not just us, and lots across industry, lots of new partnerships with civil society organisations and with governments, to tackle this. But I think one of the benefits that came out of all of that activity, hopefully it was impactful in itself, but it also really shone a light on this wider issue of the societal impact of deepfakes and AI. And research that we've done recently, 72% of people are worried about deepfakes. Only 17% of adults think they could spot a deepfake. And I would agree, from both my own experience and people that we've asked, it tends to be pretty low in terms of spotting it. So it's really shone a light on that wider issue, and actually some of the wider harms. The here and now harms that are going to impact people most are fraud and scams, where deepfakes are being used to do phishing and scam ads and circumvent security checks. Creation of child sexual abuse material, where IWF in July this year were finding 3,500 new AI-generated CSAM uploads to one dark web forum within a month. And that's increasing. And the other area that we've been really focused on is non-consensual intimate imagery, and where this is really being weaponized against women. 96%, so one piece of research, 96% of deep fakes were non-consensual imagery, and 99% of them were targeting women. So a lot of the work that we've done that was actually focused on elections has created us a focus on what do we need to do in terms of the technology architecture to mitigate the risks, how do we safeguard services, what do we need for provenance standards in terms of watermarking and provenance data, what new partnerships do we need with civil society and government in order to tackle this, how do we raise awareness, the important work that Ofcom and others are doing around media literacy. So it's almost sort of built a depth of understanding of the issue that we can now apply, and I think we need to apply to some of these other here and now challenges.
You talked about partnerships with government and civil society. What about partnerships with other commercial players, other companies in the value chain? I mean, I know there are a number of initiatives around sort of content authentication and so on, but could you talk a little bit more about how Microsoft is sort of working with others in that space?
Yeah, sure. So the most prominent example of this was the Tech Accord, which was signed around the time of the Munich Security Conference in March this year. So that was a number of technology companies coming together to sign up to a set of principles and activities that we would be all committed to running into this year of elections. So it was things like using content provenance. It was lots of companies agreeing to what standard they would use, so C2PA, content provenance and authenticity, as the standard that we would use for provenance and authentication of material, and a number of other sort of activities and principles. And so that was an example of the tech sector coming together. And then that's also led to lots of other conversations with other with charities, with civil society organisations, with governments. The tech Accord, in a way, has sort of been a mechanism that's driven a lot of other conversations. And C2PA as a standard, I think, is really important, content provenance in general, because you need to get that sort of critical mass of people to use the standard, and it needs to pull through into media literacy. So it requires partnerships in order to be impactful. So the collaboration that we've had with the BBC, with Adobe, and a number of other companies, as well as with other sectors, is going to be really important.
And do you feel that this is starting to be impactful? Are we getting the scale, as Martin was describing earlier, and the collaboration and the cooperation in order to really make a difference?
There's been a lot of progress, but we absolutely need to do more. And more around those partnerships.
Thanks. Claire, I want to come to you in a moment because obviously there is the big kind of the regulatory side of this and how and that kind of response. But Eric, I just wanted to, Simon sort of talked about the kind of the corrosive impact of a loss of trust. And for the scientific community in particular, I mean, this is a really crucial issue, isn't it? Because, science relies on public trust because, sometimes as scientists, you're trying to communicate quite big, quite important, quite difficult messages, and there's a need for people to believe that the science underpins that. Is there a concern in the scientific community that somehow public confidence is starting to be eroded a bit, and to what extent is technology seen as a sort of a cause of that?
I will answer that in a second, but I want to challenge some of the things we've said a little bit first, but also to give you an overview of the Royal Society, in case you're not aware. We're the UK's National Academy of Science. We're a 364-year-old scientific institution, and our mission basically is to promote science for the benefit of humanity. So our perspective here really is thinking about impact on, like you mentioned, trust in science, scientific disinformation, but also some of the science of disinformation, some of the evidence around this being an issue, and then some of the technical approaches towards it. So we've done a few pieces of work on this. We published a report in 2022 called The Online Information Environment, which is where a lot of what I'm about to say builds on. But we've also done a lot of work recently on AI for science. We published a report called Science in the Age of AI, which within that looked at disinformation on large language models. The thing I want to challenge is, we had a similar conversation here last year, looking ahead towards the elections and what the impact of AI would be. And the thing I mentioned there was we have much lower access to social media data than we had in previous elections. So actually it's quite hard for us to know whether there's been a huge impact or not of AI in the elections, because we simply don't have access to that. Part of that is because companies have seen that there's money to be made from their content for generative AI applications, so it's harder for researchers to access it. Also, researchers have come under pressure to not actually do some of this research. One example to think of this election, there was an audio deepfake, I think, of Wes Streeting that was done during the election, and I'd be surprised if any research has been done on that around the impacts of it. And also previously, before joining the Royal Society, a big piece of work I did on this was these deepfakes of Boris Johnson and Jeremy Corbyn endorsing each other to be Prime Minister in the 2019 election about 5 years ago. And previously did a lot of work with Chloe actually on a think tank I ran on digital democracy. Chloe's a great champion of a lot of these issues. And we had the same conversation 5 years ago, which is like, this is going to be a big issue, but then, it wasn't a massive issue, but then the research wasn't done. And the length of time it takes is quite long. So there's no single contributing factor that says this is what's eroding trust. There's lots of different factors to that. And trust doesn't erode in the 6-week election campaign, it erodes over a long period of time. So the role of AI is going to be another one of those factors that needs to be studied on its own. It's never going to be the case that someone sees a deep fake and then loses trust in democracy. It's just going to be part of the environment of that. And in terms of your question on trust in science, so the research we did in 2022 in the UK still shows quite strong public trust. So we had around sort of 90 to 95% confidence in vaccines and in man-made climate change and on all these sorts of issues. So we're really talking about issues on the margins here, but a lot of this is around continuously building trust in institutions and making sure that as we change the way we consume and produce information, we aren't sort of sacrificing the plurality of trust in media organisations, from like new and emerging media, or industry specific or academic publications, etc. And then the big challenge I think that's being presented now, that we cover in our Science in the Age of AI reports, is that potentially it's being made easier now to produce academic papers, which is making it harder to sift content, and it's actually very hard now for academic researchers to even know whether the work they're producing is novel, because there's thousands of papers being produced. It's very hard to know actually what you're producing is at the cutting edge. So I think these are the sorts of issues that we're thinking about in the scientific community, which is how does this affect peer review? How does this affect like what we know about the understanding of a certain topic, rather than the sorts of single issue, a deep fake affects this, or whatever it might be.
So the sort of information environment you described for the UK in relation to that, I mean, that you're more positive than I was expecting it to be. How does the UK compare? I can't help but think of the US feels like it's in a slightly different place, and you if you look at the UK compared to other countries and so on, do you think the UK is sort of holding up quite well, or do you think these are there are more kind of negative trends elsewhere that may affect the UK?
Truthfully, I don't know. I would say that there's a lot of discussion at the moment around not being complacent and looking at what's happening in other countries and just thinking not to be complacent about trust. And the Royal Society played a big role in this for many years. Actually, 40 years ago, next year will be the publication of the Bodmer report on the public understanding of science, and I would recommend actually that people read that report, because it's still quite relevant today, and I think the Society is looking to refresh that. So there still continues to be a lot of interest in ensuring that we maintain public trust in science, because it's not guaranteed at all. That's
really, really interesting. So, so Claire, we cannot be complacent about trust, and knowing you and colleagues at Ofcom, I know that Ofcom is an organisation that never wants to be, or would never be seen to be kind of complacent. But how, how obviously we've got the Online Safety Act, which brings in some measures, it's not a kind of totally comprehensive set of measures when we think about kind of some of these issues. But how's Ofcom adapting its kind of media literacy approach to a world where kind of synthetic content is much more prevalent? Talking to Simon's point about actually our ability as individuals to be able to sort of interpret what we're seeing.
Thank you so much for inviting me. This time last week I was running Ofcom's conference on mis and disinformation, and it is so much easier to rock up to someone else's and say a few words. So congratulations to everyone who has put this on, and thank you very much for having me. So we're 8 weeks into our 3-year media literacy strategy, which I'm sure you have all read cover to cover. It's really short. It wasn't that funny. It's really short. It's really short for Ofcom's documents, right? And we speak human. In the media literacy team, we speak human, right? There are 3 main chapters, and actually how we think about synthetic content runs through each of those chapters. So the first is research. You know that we put out an awful lot of research. We published some last Wednesday that talked about people's ability to spot mis and disinformation. We've all got different stats, haven't we? So make of that what you will. But our research suggested that about 30% of people were very confident that they could identify synthetic content. About 30% were unsure, and 33% were completely convinced they would have no idea. And I think that's quite illuminating. I think that's quite challenging for us as an organisation thinking about media literacy, but for all of us, because the key thought in our strategy is that media literacy has to be everyone's business, and we can talk about what that means a bit later on if we can get to it in questions. So endless research from Ofcom. We're a research powerhouse, as you know, on all different aspects of synthetic content and what it means for people. Our second chapter in our strategy talks about working with platforms, online platforms, and also the broadcasters. They are the organisations that have universal reach. So those devices that we all carry around in our pockets, those apps, all of those things that are now ubiquitous in how most of the population, we can get onto digital inclusion if you want to, but how most of the population lives their daily life. those organisations have a profound responsibility to be designed in a way that promotes media literacy and to allow people to make the choices that they want to make. Media literacy for Ofcom, I should have said at the start, is about encouraging people to navigate content safely and flourish online. It is beyond online safety. It's being able to do what you want to do, whether that's finding the latest episode of Wolf Hall on iPlayer, whether that's paying for your parking, booking your doctor's appointment, looking up dinosaurs for your son's homework, whatever it is, right? So what can services do? Well, we've got best practice principles for media literacy by design that a number of organisations have signed up to. We're very keen to hear from others. But it's everything, as you know, Simon was talking about provenance, but also prevention. What are the services doing to prevent the creation and the dissemination of harmful deepfakes? And then enforcement. Are the platforms using their own terms and conditions appropriately to enforce the type of content that you can see on their sites? The third area of our strategy is about people, right? Media literacy fundamentally at its heart is about people. What are you doing online? Can you do what you want and what you need to do? Last Wednesday, we announced that we're now on the hunt for organisations that can help run a programme called Untold Stories. That's working at a really local community level, helping people, challenging, inviting people to think about how their stories, how their news could be told. We'll be looking at synthetic material about deepfakes in that, as well as all aspects of the news production process. We'll run that in areas of financial deprivation, because we know that's a compounding factor for media literacy challenges, but also, and crucially, because the more people that can get their stories heard, the more people perhaps will understand the process of professional news and information and what the opportunities and challenges and costs of that are. Finally, Ofcom is one of a number of players and actors in the media literacy world. We genuinely think it needs to be everyone's business. Part of our role is to equip, empower, catalyse the sector. We know quite a bit about media literacy, but also about deepfakes because of the work that we've done and synthetic content. So actually one of the things you'll see in our strategy is that we're going to bring all of that together, all of that knowledge and insight about what we know on the ground, what our research is telling us. We've got research on how people believe, how you get into what we're calling politely minority beliefs, which looks at climate change, the war in Ukraine, and vaccines. So the journey that you go on and the role of being online and offline. So from every aspect, we're going to bring that all together and share that with anyone who is interested. Finally, you asked for some provocations to finish with. I've got more provocations than answers as ever. But particularly about media literacy, if synthetic content becomes indistinguishable from authentic content, what are the limitations then of media literacy? What is it reasonable to expect of Joe Schmo? Because I am getting increasingly concerned that if the answer to every question is media literacy, right, there is not enough money, there are not enough organisations, and I think the expectations are unrealistic. So what are the expectations of individuals? What are the expectations of online services, actually? And is provenance and detection and prevention and enforcement enough, or do we need more? I've got loads more, but I might stop there.
I think that's a really, really interesting provocation. And I think, because I think there's something quite interesting about the way in which we as humans are adapting to this world of more synthetic information. I mean, we, for the last 150 years, we've been the generation of humans that have had access to photographs, right? And we've decided that this was a technology that gave a very accurate representation of things that actually happened, and we invest an enormous amount of trust, in these photographic images, and that's about to change, because we're going to have this proliferation of images that look exactly the same, but we know may not be, an image taken in a moment of time or something that actually happened, and that it sort of messes with your head a little bit, doesn't it? In terms of the how do we then start to live in this world where we no longer have this sort of same level of trust, and sort of slightly tangentially, but I think it's sort of related. I think it's quite interesting that what we're also seeing at this time of the proliferation of digital media is, with particularly younger people who are native to the digital media, a real interest in going back to analog technologies. So whether it's film cameras, whether it's analog hi-fi equipment, records. I mean, I think basically, I think online. LP sales, are maxed out in terms of the production capacity that the industry has. The industry can't print enough, LPs now in terms of the market desire for them. So it does seem at the same time there is a generation who are native to this technology, but are also kind of drawing a line in their own worlds between kind of what maybe they feel is more authentic, versus the everyday digital. Is that something that we're sort of thinking about? And so, is there any research into that kind of this almost the sociological impact of that?
I mean, the raw site hasn't done anything on it, but I would say that people crave, human attention. So I think where we've seen influencers be very successful, for example, is because they are, people feel like they know that the person who, the influencer or whoever it might be online, and if they lose that, then maybe they'll seek it elsewhere. But I would say something quickly on verification, which you spoke about a little bit at the beginning there. So, as you mentioned, over time it will become harder to detect synthetic content. If you project, and the way I try to think about it is to project 10, 20, 30 years into the future rather than 5 years into the future. And like I mentioned, 5 years ago, worked on this project around deep fakes of Johnson and Corbyn, and in 5 years it's moved on massively from how amateur it was almost to do that just 5 years ago. So projecting 30 years ahead, you can imagine it's going to be much, much harder. And some of the research we've done at the Royal Society on this, we did a similar experiment on deepfake detection. We used videos of Tom Cruise, which you can read in our report, The Online Information Environment, and again, very low levels of detection with and without a content warning. So first experiment was no content warning. Second experiment with a content warning, and detection only went up very slightly. So even with these sorts of tools that we might think may be helpful, there's still limited impact. We've also looked at content provenance. So we did a workshop with the BBC about maybe a year and a half ago, maybe longer than that actually. And again, this is a really important mechanism because there needs to be a way to detect whether content was AI generated. It's just one tool in the pack. But again, huge vulnerabilities with that. It'd be easy to, the classic example is to take a picture of a picture and then you might undermine any watermarking, or you could amend a few pixels in a genuine image and have it flagged as manipulated content. And then looking at large language models, it's a whole sort of different kettle of fish, text-based content. And we did an exercise ahead of the AI Safety Summit where we got climate scientists and infectious disease experts to try and break the guardrails of Llama 2, and they were able to do so very easily and very specifically because they had much more deeper understanding of issues around vaccines and climate, which the companies themselves won't have, and it will be hard to do this sort of building of guardrails at scale. So I think it's very, very challenging. And then finally, on information literacy, I'm still a big believer in information literacy, and the Royal Society made a recommendation on this, that there needs to be lifelong adult information literacy, and we're hoping to publish something on this in the next a month or so. And one challenge we found as a bit of a preview, we tried to get involved some of the smaller news channels, so like sort of non-English language UK-specific channels, to engage in media literacy conversations, information literacy conversations, and couldn't get any of them into the room, but barely could contact them. So it's very, very difficult, even now after like a decade's worth of people talking about mis and disinformation, to reach all of the different avenues that people are receiving their content about science or democracy or any of these other important issues.
Thank you. So Chloe, so a bit of consensus in terms of media literacy is going to remain important and really significant. But Claire kind of making a very reasonable point, which is, how much media literacy is it going to take? And I suppose also a question about and who's going to deliver it, and is the willingness sort of, amongst kind of government politicians generally to kind of actually say, we're going to have to put more resource against this. When we've got all of these other challenges in terms of funding public services, funding education, and so on. But realistically, are there going to be the resources, the capability, the knowledge to deliver the kind of media literacy campaigns that I think Eric would like, and I think Claire would like to help deliver?
Well, I mean, first of all, I joined the panel in being a strong believer in the transparency tools. I didn't mention that earlier on, but I think it's extremely important and actually legislated for one variant of that myself in terms of digital imprints on political material. So it's important. But actually, there is a limit here, I think, to the extent to which any of this could ever be done by some sort of central project. The clue might be in a word you just used yourself, which is, well, you have to do the rest of education as well. So very fundamentally, that education, for anyone else in the room like me who has primary school age kids, right, that education is going to change. The time that child first encounters the idea of primary and secondary sources in their history lesson is now going to be fundamentally differently done than it would have been 5 years ago, 30 years ago, and so on. So it may not be that there is such a thing as a standalone thing as media literacy. Actually, this is going to be what education will consist of. How do you think critically? How do you deal with material that you see in front of you? How do you, I hope, this is my hope bit, continue to speak to other human beings, right? I hope that's in there somewhere. And by the way, in the stats I quoted, I could have mentioned the point that word of mouth is considered still very important in elections. That's high on the list. A large number of people say that that's how they get their information. And I really hope that's true. I appreciate in London nobody talks to their neighbour, but actually 90% of the population, people do. And let's hope that continues. So, yes to transparency, yes to literacy, but I think actually fundamentally we would look to educate our children in a different way.
Can I come in on that? So I think that's absolutely right. My children are nearly 11 and nearly 13. There's no sign of the analogue thing going on in our house, but I'm interested if that's seen elsewhere. Education is crucially important, and of course the DFE have just done a curriculum review. I think that's just closed, but we'll be fascinated to see what comes out of that. But it can't just be children, right? Adults need this information too. Everything we know about how you deliver media literacy effectively is that it's absolutely not large organisations rocking up and going, don't worry, Ofcom's here now, it's all going to be fine, right? That's a disaster in local communities. It's about empowering organisations that have the trusted relationships with the people who need the skills or the insight or whatever it is, the support, and empowering and funding them to deliver media literacy alongside whatever else they're doing. So to your standalone point, I couldn't agree more. The more we make it a thing on its own, the more challenging it is. And I do think there's quite a lot to do in education too.
Yeah, and I know we just put a very long submission into the curriculum review, and actually that all these points around kind of critical thinking, the ability to evaluate and to source information was a big theme in what we put in, and I think will be a big theme in other submissions. I am keen to open up to the floor if there are questions. There you go, loads. Do we have somebody with the mic? I don't see anybody. Oh. We can start the question here, please.
Hello, Ben Hawes. I want to talk really about the second half of the question, the impact, and how much we know after a year of elections about what has changed in the targeting of information, because it's bound to get better because a great deal of the internet is paid for by the targeting of advertising, so you would expect that to get better. As Eric mentioned, that there are researchers are sometimes getting less access to this information. And you don't always need to persuade groups of people of something that isn't true if you can persuade them not to vote. Do we have anything coming out of this? And I think it's interesting that the last government did remove, create an exception to data protection law to allow political organisations to use personal data around political opinions. Do we think in retrospect that was a good thing to have done? But actually, has anyone done any research on the impact of this, on where we are on targeting, rather than the deep fakes?
Thank you. Sam?
Yeah, I'm happy to come in on that, and it sort of goes back to Ariq's first intervention, which I completely agree with, by the way, which is that we don't know enough. I think there is a need for more research in this area. At Microsoft, we do a lot of research. We've got an organisation we call Microsoft Threat Assessment Centre, which is looking at scale at state disinformation campaigns. And so we've got a lot of data on those campaigns, the actors that are trying to cause problems for democracy using information operations campaigns. But I can't say that we've got a good handle on to your point, on the impact. What I would say, and this sort of goes back to Tariq's point on the research agenda, I think what we're currently seeing is predominantly impact in terms of scale. So it's enabling people who are trying to cause problems for democracy to scale their activities by producing content more rapidly, more convincingly, creating audio or video deepfakes. I think the Wes Street example is interesting, I agree, particularly giving it such a narrow margin in that constituency. You know, we could be talking about a very different impact on the UK election if that had gone the other way and there'd been a deepfake just before it. So I think there are those examples of sort of specific possible impact in specific examples. But I think the research agenda really, and thinking ahead to future elections, if we have another big year of elections in 5 years' time, or less than that, is going to be the more systemic view of how is all of this data. And we did see examples in the US election of where particularly groups that we believe to be linked to China weren't looking at the kind of individual example. They were looking at how do we wholesale use data to create profiles that are more impactful with particular target audiences and use that to kind of cause discord and herding behaviour. So I think we don't know enough about that, but I do think there's enough to really think about that for the future.
Thank you. Gentleman there, got the mic.
Thank you. Thank you. Ray Eitel-Porter. Claire, you mentioned that maybe media literacy won't be enough on its own, and then you said, is provenance verification enough? What else is there beyond provenance verification that you would point to?
I don't know, because I'm not a technologist, and I think if I knew that, I might not be sitting on this panel. I might be monetising that, because I think it's a really significant problem. What I do know is it's going to take the tech companies, civil society groups, education, regulators, everybody needs to play their part, because the opportunity cost of getting this wrong is immense. Elections are profoundly important, but it's beyond that. It's about trust in news, it's about trust in each other. So I don't have a technical solution for you, I'm afraid, but I can tell you that unless we all work on it, I think there's a major problem coming.
Simon, did you want to come in?
Yeah, just quickly to build on that, and it also builds on your previous point about media literacy is not enough, the technology is not enough. I think that there isn't just one solution. I don't think there will ever be. If we just sort of think there's going to be one target to aim at, and if we suddenly get provenance right, we need all of the above, and they all need to be working together. So we need to think of this, as you said earlier, this is a human challenge. We need to give humans the tools that they need to improve the ability for them to be able to verify what they're seeing, but know that those will be broken. So we need to be thinking about how do we keep iterating on the technology. C2PA's got better since it was first brought out. We need to be thinking about C2PA and watermarking. What else can we do through standardization on transparency standards? We need to be doing all of the above, and we need to be doing them in concert with each other.
That's right. Thank you. And last question now.
Thank you. James Johns. The UK has decided that it doesn't want to bear the consequences of allowing political advertising on one particularly widespread form of technology, namely broadcast television. And that's probably kept a lot of money out of politics and avoided us seeing some of the kind of consequences of having these sort of unlimited budget campaigns that we see elsewhere in the world. I'd like to ask the panel whether they think there's an argument for banning political advertising, targeted political advertising on online platforms and social media platforms for similar reasons.
Can I?
Yes.
I understand and I respect the premise of the question, but I think no, there isn't a good case for that. And it's because it would very rapidly become unworkable legislation. It would be testing the boundaries of what's already been capable of being defined in law. And I refer back to how we had to do it on digital imprints. It becomes very difficult actually to articulate who it is you're targeting. Not targeting, well, that's confusing in this context. Who it is you are specifying in the law, who you are then accusing of doing some targeting. The Online Safety Act had some elements of similar problems. So we have to be quite respectful, I think, of the limits of how law can be used as a tool on a problem. I would return to the absolute core point I made earlier on, which is, in the end, you have to trust people. People can choose what they think of a given advert. It is up to them what choice they make in that context.
Thank you very much.